Welcome friends, it's Caleigh Bird, and today I'm going to show you 3 different ways to blend your oil paints. We've got wet on wet, we've got wet on dry, and we've got dry on wet. And if you don't know what those are, then you should definitely stick around because I'm going to teach you a little something today. And if I do, please hit that thumbs up button, make sure you pop that subscribe button, ding the bell, and come back every single week for all the best fine art tutorials and art biz advice. When we are thinking of blending colors, we want to blend colors that are close together in tonal value. If you are going to start with something light, you're going to want to blend it with something that is not too far away on the tonal value scale nor on the color wheel, because this is going to make for a much smoother blend than if you were to say start off with that same bright yellow, but instead try to jump directly into your alizarin crimson. This is a bit too close to try to blend together. You would have more success instead taking your crimson, having your yellow, and actually, here, we'll make that a little bit more yellow, and then actually having more of an orange blended in between it already. So you would have this orange already mixed together, and then you would blend those 3 together rather than trying to jump from this bright yellow all the way to this red in one quick blend. Now when we say blend, we don't always mean make smoother. So if we were to blend this yellow into this ochre color, and we want to do it in more of a painterly fashion, this is when we will use the first method, and this is wet on wet. So the paint, both paints are wet, the brush is wet. We're using a wet paint with a wet paint with a wet brush, and then you're simply just going to kind of knead the brush back and forth over the paint, which will create a nice blended painterly effect where you'll still be able to see the brush strokes, which add nice character, but that is not completely smoothly blended. And with this technique, you may need to go back and forth a little bit and add a little bit more of each color. But in the end, you'll wind up with a nice gradient that also has some really good character. And many artists, when they say don't blend your paint, what they actually mean is lay in your color very close next to each other rather than trying to smooth things out. So this is more of a wet on wet method when we are laying our paint closely together, dabbing things around, being gentle with it, but not actually smoothing things over to a harsh degree. For this next method, if you have some old paintbrushes that are a bit frayed, splayed, and downright fuzzy, they work great. The second method is going to be called dry on wet. So we'll start off with 2 colors that we wish to blend, and they're both wet paint. And instead of using this wet brush, we use one of our older fuzzy brushes as a dry brush to come on top. So both of the paints start off wet, and we use a dry brush to smoothly blend the 2 together. Now the key to using a dry brush is that you want it to stay dry. So as it gets paint on it, you want to be constantly wiping it off, because ideally the bristles should not really pick up paint. They should only be slowly moving it around. Now this method is both good and bad because it has a tendency of over blending. So this might look nice, and it does look nice for certain surfaces, but there are many other surfaces that this will look too smooth upon. Surprisingly, portraits and facial features and skin in general honestly looks very strange when it's hyper blended. It tends to look plastic. So although this is a good method to certain degrees, you don't want to over hyper blend anything because you're going to get an unnatural smoothness that doesn't actually wind up making sense and will wind up looking quite sterile, cold, and unrealistic. And then the very last way is honestly the most subtle. It is called scumbling, and it is a wet on dry. So basically what that means is that your initial layer of paint is going to need to be dry. So this last method has to be done over multiple days. So I'm going to show you what it looks like both on just a regular yellow block that is not shaded at all, and I'm also going to show you the effect of scumbling on something that is slightly shaded, and we're going to use it to intensify the effect, because the latter is actually more how scumbling is supposed to be done. Scumbling is not supposed to be an end-all be-all for shading. It is supposed to be an addition to the shading that you already do during the wet on wet layers. So I'm going to prepare this to be a bit of a gradient, but not a super strong gradient, and I'm going to show you how using scumbling will punch this up a bit. That this paint is completely dry. I did this 2 days ago, and remember I did 2 of them because I wanted you to see what happens when you try to scumble on a single base coat, if you're trying to make a leap, or if you decide to scumble on something that has already had some blending to it. So even though it is considered a wet on dry, we still don't want a whole lot of paint. I just literally dabbed this into a little bit of paint. You don't want it to be super laden. It needs to be kind of dry, and we are going to kind of scratch it over that. So as I had said before, this is a method to use when you're really trying to knock in a color and make it a little bit darker and more intense. You do not want to use this as your general blending method. This is if you decide that you want that orange to be a bit more intense, so you're going to come over it. And I feel like the word scumble kind of describes what you do very well. You're literally just kind of scratching around on top. And for this particularly, I do like to use a stiffer brush. So for this, I will use more of a hog's bristle brush, or I even have a small stiff one. So for scumbling, I highly recommend using a stiffer brush, and you're literally just going to kind of scratch it on over there, and then slightly, so I'm pressing harder and then pressing lighter to get a lighter effect. And you will pick up whatever the texture is that you're painting on, but it can really help to give a nice blend, and see how that made that so much deeper without altering it. However, if you decide to try to make a big leap, it just doesn't work out as well. So if I was trying to make this that same dark tone, instead of blending it beforehand and then maybe coming in and scumbling again, I'm just trying to do it just with the scumble. It really doesn't wind up working out. It doesn't wind up looking very clean and neat, and you don't get that richness to it. This has much more of a richness to the gradient. You can see all the colors coming through. That really makes sense. And the nice thing is that you can also wipe away a little bit. So if you scumble a bit on there and it's maybe a little bit too much, you can wipe it away. And that kind of gives a nice blend, you know, again, a little back and forth with the paint. But you don't want to make a huge jump like this, because this looks like red on yellow, whereas this has a nice blend between the red, orange, and yellow. And this scumbling is fantastic for making your tones deeper. And you can also use scumbling for knocking in like a really bright highlight. So sometimes you can use pure white or something that is mixed very lightly, and you can just dab it in on as a highlight. So kind of putting something in doesn't really blend out as well. I would not recommend blending it out, but for just dashing in a highlight, it can work quite effectively. So scumbling is definitely something you have to play around with a little bit. It's not all going to be a smooth blend the way it is when you have wet on wet paint, but it definitely is, as I said, a great way to just knock in some super dark tones, maybe that you weren't able to get quite as resonant with the first time you went over it. Want to learn even more about oil painting? Awesome, you are in luck, because this video is actually just one part of my complete guide to oil painting series, which includes videos not only about the best paints, brushes, and supplies to stock in your own art studio, but detailed instruction on how to actually use all your supplies, as well as sharing my own personal painting techniques. You can actually watch this entire series completely for free, either on my Skillshare or here in this playlist right here, because I have got a wealth of oil painting knowledge to share with you. So if you did learn something today, please go ahead and hit the thumbs up button. Make sure you're subscribed, hit the notification bell, and come back every single week for all the best fine art tutorials and art biz advice.